Italian verbs are easy, facili. Qualcosa è cambiato. Ciao studenti, hello everyone, and let's keep going with the basics, the foundation of the Italian language, and today we're looking at Italian verbs. This is just an overview and introduction to how Italian verbs work. Most students who approach the Italian language for the first time are scared of Italian verbs. There's this idea, this myth, let's call it, that Italian verbs are very, very difficult. They're a nightmare. I'll never get them. It's impossible. I'll never get it right. And let me tell you, they're not as hard as they portray them. And my job here, as much as I can do in a short video, is to help you understand how they're not as scary as they may have been portrayed to you. So let me start with saying something very important. Both your language, English, and my language, Italian, are complex in different ways. When you look at the English language, there are so many tenses, it's crazy. You can express nuances just by using the right tense that we cannot in Italian. And so you will find, and I encourage you to just open up a verb book for English and see how many tenses you have. You have tenses like, I should have been waiting, and tenses like that do not exist in Italian. So you English speakers are complex. You have complexity in terms of tense selection. There are so many, they are so specific, whereas Italian is complex in a different way. So yes, when I open the video saying they're super easy, the Italian verbs are easy, maybe I exaggerated a little because there is a level of complexity. To help you understand what makes Italian verbs complex to most learners of Italian, it's the fact that each subject has its own unique form of the verb. Now, this is not completely new to you as an English speaker because the verb to be in the present tense, the most common verb in English, actually does the same. You have three forms of the verb for the three first subjects. I am, you are, it is. So you have three different conjugations of the same verb to be in the present tense. This is what the Italian language does. But we do it for all subjects. Now, as you know, you've learned this recently, Italian has 6 possible subjects. Like in English, we call them first, second, and third person singular and plural. And so what makes it complex to most people and makes you scared is the fact that you think that you have to memorize 6 different forms for every verb on the face of the earth. So any verb that you want to use in Italian, you have to memorize 6 different forms for each tense. Now, that is not completely false, meaning it is true that every tense has 6 different forms for the same verb, like I showed you for English. And so present tense of the verb mangiare, you will learn very soon, would be something like io mangio, tu mangi, lei mangia. Noi mangiamo, voi mangiate, loro mangiano. So yes, 6 different forms depending on who's performing the action. And so if we switch to a different tense, you would have, again, 6 different forms. And so that is more complex than in English. But the reality is that there are a lot of tricks and hacks and patterns that I will teach you, maybe not here in this 30-day series, but I can teach you in our courses, where you basically understand how it works, and then you can just guess how a verb is going to be conjugated. So it's not as hard as they told you. Italian verbs have patterns, so you will be able to group them. You might find that a verb does something for all 6 subjects. Well, there will be a ton of other verbs that do the same thing, and so you will learn them together. You will group them in your head, and you will be fine. And there's a lot of repetition in the patterns. Bottom line is, it's totally doable, and I want you to do it. So when it comes to Italian verbs, we typically divide them into 3 main groups. Verbs that end with are, verbs that end in ere, and verbs that end in ire. So when you learn a verb, you will usually learn it in the infinitive, like you do in English with to go, to say, to sing, with that to part. Well, Italian verb doesn't have the to part before the verb, but the verb itself ends with one of those 3 patterns. The reality is that there are some other groups that we usually don't teach them as groups because there's only like a handful of them. But let's go with the 3 main groups: are verbs, ere verbs, and ire verbs. Here's the good news. Most verbs belong in the first group, are. And the other good news is that most are verbs, or many are verbs, are regular, which means once you learn how they work in a certain tense, any other are verb that you learn will work the same way. Now, all of this is going to be abstract today because we're not learning any specific verb today. You'll have to wait till tomorrow for that. But I want to reassure you that are verbs are the biggest group and it's the easiest. Now we have ere verbs that tend to be irregular a lot. And then we have the smaller group, which is ire. Ire, we can say that they're mostly regular. There's a bunch of irregular verbs that are not really irregular. They just behave in a certain way. And again, it's very learnable. There's nothing scary about any of this. As I mentioned earlier, there are, like in any language, regular verbs, which is the majority of the verbs, and then there are irregular verbs. So for regular verbs, what does that mean? That means that they follow a pattern. And once you know the pattern for any tense that you learn, you will start with the present tense, but then you will move on to the past tense and other tenses. But once you learn the pattern, all you have to do is recognize that it's an are verb, for example, and then you will be able to conjugate it. That means that you will be able to personalize any verb that you see or learn and use it correctly for the correct subject. So it's not that scary. Now you will have also irregular verbs. Irregular verbs, just like in English, they are weird and they need to be memorized. But again, you can memorize irregular verbs. It'll take a little bit of effort, but you will also realize that many irregular verbs have the same irregularity. And so once you learn how one irregular verb works, you will find that there is 2, 3, 10, 20 verbs that use the same kind of irregular pattern. And again, it's totally doable. So before I leave you to your Italian immersion, I want to give you some tips for how you can handle verbs. So a great strategy to learn Italian verbs is to learn similar verbs together. Let's say you learn the verb prendere, which means to take. Then you will see that the verb apprendere, which means to learn, includes the verb prendere. And so they're going to be conjugated the same. And so there's so many ways to lump verbs together, and it's going to be super helpful. When it comes to irregular verbs, you're going to have to memorize them. Maybe you'll have to repeat them a bunch of times, but you will get them. But here's the tip that nobody gives, but I think it's super valuable. And that is, don't just, when you're doing your rote drills, so you are repeating a verb, you're conjugating it, don't just go things like io mangio, tu mangi, lui mangia, noi mangiamo, voi mangiate, loro mangiano, because your brain at this stage is still very fresh and it's just a bunch of words that don't make any sense. And so I encourage you to think of the verb that you're conjugating. So let's say mangiare. I'm using this one because I know that you kind of know that mangiare means to eat. So even though you don't know how to conjugate yet, you learn that tomorrow. But let's say mangiare. Don't just say mangio for I eat or io mangio, but make a full sentence. And so internalize that io mangio una pesca, I eat a peach. So grab a peach and bite into it and just know that you're actually doing the eating of the peach. So, when you say tu mangi la pizza, well, maybe use a question and ask a friend, somebody that is in the same room with you, and say, tu mangi la pizza? Are you eating pizza? So make mini sentences that have meaning, and that's going to help you, I think. So, abbiamo finito per oggi. Alla prossima. Ciao.